think probably now, Carole, although we've still got people coming in, I think we should get underway. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you in particular to Carole Cadwalladr, who many of you will know either through the work that she did on Cambridge Analytica or through the work that she was doing, and that perhaps the legal battles that she was fighting with Arron Banks. And more recently, and perhaps slightly less well known, is the work she's doing through All the Citizens, and being a very prominent member of that organisation. So really, I've left it to Carole to decide what she wants to focus on. I suspect the questions will range far and wide as well, but I'm sure we're all going to have a very stimulating time, and I suspect many people on this call have great respect for you, Carole, and the work that you've done, and often the very, very unpleasant nature of some of the representations that have been made to you, or and so on. I think we all know what I'm talking about. But so, Carole, over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody for coming today. And it's really lovely actually to I was sort of really encouraged by the what Unlocked Democracy is doing, and the fact that it's got all of you who are sort of committed to this idea, and to try and uphold democracy. And obviously that's been very much sort of close to my heart over the last 4 years. So it's always kind of nice and encouraging when you meet other people who are sort of concerned about these issues. So thank you for the work that you're doing as well. And I have to say, until I got onto the call, I hadn't sort of really thought about what I was going to say. I sort of said to Tom, oh, well, yes, can we do it as a Q&A? So apologies for my lack of preparation. But I suppose, I mean, maybe I'll just sort of talk briefly about sort of like what I'm doing now and how I got to that place. And really, it's, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the sort of journalism that I've done over the last 4.5 years, essentially. But I I stumbled down this rabbit hole in terms of investigating the use of technology, really, the effect of technology upon our politics, and particularly on our elections. It was literally a few days after Trump got elected in November 2016. And that was when I wrote this first article about fake news, essentially. And it's the ways that the technology and the social media platforms in particular had been exploited in the election of Trump, and peripherally at that time in the Brexit referendum. And I actually started, the first article I wrote was very much based upon, it was all about Google search actually. But I was so sort of horrified about what I came across that it led me on this sort of journey, which is where I've ended up in this place now. And essentially what happened, I couldn't really sort of believe what I was seeing, which was I started off investigating Google search. And the first thing more or less that I did, which was that I just put Jews into the Google search bar, and I turned it into a question, and I put, are Jews? And the first suggestion that Google gave me was, are Jews evil? And I was sort of like, well, this is so weird. Why is Google suggesting this? And it gave me this page of results, which said, all of them said that Jews are evil. And then the next suggestion it had in the search bar was the suggestion, did the Holocaust happen? And I clicked on that link, and it took me to this page of results, all of which said the Holocaust didn't happen. And I sort of recap on this because it was discovering this sort of like something weird had essentially happened on the internet that had distorted these search results across all sorts of subjects, and threw up these, bizarre anti-Semitic hate sites. And the fact that I couldn't get Google to do anything about it, when I wrote that first article, there was a massive hoo-ha. It went completely viral. Everybody was like, this is so terrible, this is shocking. and then they moved on and Google didn't do anything about it. And I think that was my sort of first, and you know, what I had been, so as a feature writer at The Observer, my sort of methodology was that I threw myself into a big piece, I wrote about it, and then I moved on to the next subject. And for me, this was just so sort of horrific that this anti-Semitic hate stuff and these lies about the Holocaust were being spread by this massive company. They were refusing to take responsibility. They were refusing to sort of change the results. I couldn't even get an answer out of the press office. That I ended up writing about it the next week, and then it still didn't. And so I ended up writing about it the next week, and I kind of went on like this. And actually, in that particular instance, there was this sort of global outrage, and there was some change from Google. And along the way, what happened is this mad company started writing to me, Cambridge Analytica, complaining about their inclusion in an article. And so that's what sent me on this direction. But I think essentially I sort of start with there because what sort of, for me, it was this, that one thing led to another thing, led to another thing. And the sort of the common theme all through it has been that there's just been, even when you sort of discover these terrible scandals and wrongdoing, like we did with Cambridge Analytica and like we did with the Brexit referendum, we're living in this age at the moment when there's no consequences. And even when you sort of publish this evidence, and even when you get these investigations kicked off, there's actually, then the sort of news cycle goes on, nobody gets held to account, there's very few repercussions. And so this sort of, I just got increasingly fed up about this. And particularly when I was writing about what happened in the referendum in Britain, I was confined in this very small bubble, which was that we were printing this stuff in the Guardian and Observer, and it just wasn't being picked up by the rest of the press because of the sort of very partisan nature of the press in Britain. So anyhow, sorry, that was quite a sort of boring entree to it, but I think this what sort of like became this sort of burning question for me is that, well, how actually do you hold power to account in this day and age when everybody's completely shameless and things like big tech are beyond even the reach of parliaments, and you know, even huge scandals on the front page of newspapers have no effect. And so anyhow, all of those things led me to set up this tiny little organization, which I've been doing for the last year and a half, called The Citizens. And that really came from this sort of thinking about just like the completely under-resourced nature of investigative journalism, that I sort of, you know, I was sort of doing what I was doing without any big team, more or less by myself for a lot of the time. And so I was really like, how do we get more resource into investigative journalism? And then I was like, how do we actually tell these stories to people other than Guardian readers? How do we do it in sort of different ways, using social media and more sort of interesting storytelling? And then I was like, and then how do we actually you know, change things? How do we hold them to account? And so that's when I also started thinking about other sort of strategies, like, so strategic litigation, suing the bastards. That was a sort of like very attractive new sort of tool for me. And then also as well, I've always been a great fan of, there's sort of some things which this country does do well. And I actually admire the tabloids for their sort of, the tabloids have always been quite good at sort of campaigning journalism and stunts as well. And in a way, I think that sort of, you know, it's possible to learn from. And so we're also sort of interested in, I'd sort of call it sort of performative journalism almost. And that's led to sort of a number of experimental projects, which I've been doing over the last year. One of which is that I've been very involved with Independent Sage, which some of you might have come across, which is a sort of blended model of science and journalism in a way. And then there's another project we set up in which was sort of inspired by that, called the Real Facebook Oversight Board. And that was sort of trying the same trick very much ahead of the US election in America, when it was patently obvious that Trump was trying to use Facebook to subvert the election there, and nobody could do anything about it. And then finally, the final thing I just to sort of, we launched just about a month ago, just over a month ago, a project here called Keeping the Receipts. And that is a sort of, I think we call it a transparency project, but the whole idea of that is that we sort of borrowed it from the Trump era in America, and it was somebody set up this thing called the weekly list, because their sort of idea was that they took it from scholars of authoritarianism, who said that unless you keep track of what's going on, then it's like boiling the frog. You don't notice that your sort of freedoms and institutions are being eroded. So that we're just sort of literally got somebody, we've got this guy called Max, who's just putting it all in a spreadsheet, and just so we can sort of, you're visualizing what's actually happening. And, you know, and I think even today, as Tom was sort of saying, you know, there's a car crash of just things happening. It's really hard to keep track. So anyhow, that's the sort of the final project that I can sort of tell you about now. But sorry, that was a long witter. So I shall hand back over to Tom for more precision and focus.
Thank you, Carole. And I hope, well, I think what you did was set out very briefly the very wide range of actions you've undertaken. And I will allow myself just one question before taking the first from other people on the call. And that is, what do you think, what more can be done to try to hold the social media companies to account? Is it something that only governments can do? Is it something that citizens can do? Or do we just throw our hands up in the air and give up?
Well, that's a great question. And yeah, it's something I kind of think about the whole time. And you know, on the one hand, but basically one of the big issues is that because the social media platforms are all based in America, there's a lot which comes down to what happens in the US. Does US Congress act? I mean, also in Europe, that is also very much a thing. But then in the meantime, you know, one of the things we know is that the platforms, they don't self-regulate, and they don't respond to well, they do respond to some pressure, but this thing about like what citizens can do, I think is really crucial, because one of the few things we know they respond to is public pressure. It is only when there is a sort of media shitstorm that they do actually respond. So I think and that's very much part of like what our ethos was with the Real Facebook Oversight Board, was that what we did was we brought together the sort of civil rights leaders in America with the sort of leading tech scholars, and we were trying to operate almost like a sort of an anti-spin unit for Facebook, because they spend, you know, it's such a sort of unequal battle, because they spend absolutely millions on PR and lobbying, and you know, the sort of civil society, in contrast, has got tiny amounts of money. So we were trying to use sort of, again, tricks and stunts to create outsized noise. But in that sense is that I think that, you know, it's change has to come politically. There has to be a political will to act. And so that's where pressure from people to their politicians is really important, I think. So I do actually think that everybody does have a bit of a role to play in that, but it does terrify me that the amount of power that they have, and you know, the complete lack of oversight, and you know what was happening in the US before this election, and the ways that Trump was using these platforms, you know, that's, you know, why we did this project, because it really did seem sort of genuinely terrifying to me. This alignment essentially between, you know, these kind of populist authoritarians and these technology companies, and the sort of combination of them was very worrying, I thought.
Well, I think, but you earlier in your contribution, you highlighted the impact that individuals can make, and I, like I suspect perhaps some other people on the call, did search on Google for Jews and also Muslims, and I'm pleased to say certainly the first page of responses were all sensible and not of the nature that you described. So clearly that was a campaign that you were very successful in securing change to. Now I'm going to start going through people's questions. I'm not going to ask people to ask them themselves, simply because hopefully we will be able to get through all of the questions if I ask them. So the first question is from Jennifer Evans. Hi Carole, I'm a big fan and followed you for years. Our democracy is disappearing faster than the Johnson variant is spreading. How do we protect what is left?
I wish I knew the answer. So thank you for the question. I wish I knew the answer, but again, I think it just, again, like there are tiny little bits of encouragement, I think. So I don't know about you, but during the sort of the years between the Brexit years, as I can call them, I felt like I was just hitting my head against a brick wall, in that I was, you know, having uncovered these various illegalities that happened during the referendum, you know, that these sort of this gross, deliberate unlawfulness by the Vote Leave campaign and by Leave EU, you know, and not just one crime, but these multiple ones. And I felt this sort of like weight of responsibility, that because I sort of had this sort of evidence, that I sort of needed to keep going out and to sort of try and make people aware of it. And there was very little in the way it felt to me of kind of backup and support and infrastructure around any of these things. And the thing that the difference for me now at this moment in time is this: there is a sort of grassroots, sort of counter movements and organisations which are cropping up and are doing things and are being effective. And even though it's tiny compared to, say, for example, in America, it is the thing which gives me sort of like little rays of hope. So it is things like, you know, like, so Jolyon's Good Law Project, like Foxglove Legal, like there's another one, the AWO, which is a data rights agency, like us. You know, Open Democracy has been around a bit longer, and that's why I was sort of very delighted to hook up with Tom and Unlock Democracy on a couple of, we've been cooking up some plans for sort of joint initiatives. And so for me, it does feel like there is this sort of, that, you know, that there is a growing movement, and it's properly grassroots. It is coming from the people up. And although it's tiny and under-resourced, and, you know, none of us have got any money apart from Jolyon, I think, is that there is stuff that we can do. And so that's the thing, I think, which keeps me going at the moment, is that, you know, it's a very unequal fight, but, you know, I'm also very sort of disappointed. You know, there's lots of things where I just sort of feel that the opposition is also missing in action. But I do think into that vacuum, there are these sort of citizen responses. So, yeah. So for me, there's a little rays of sunshine.
Thank you, Carole. And you've mentioned some of the organisations that are campaigning in this field that obviously people can join. And also, I think it's incumbent on organisations like the ones that you've mentioned, Open Democracy, Unlock Democracy, Compass and so on, to actually work together so that we're not duplicating effort. And there's significant moves a step to try to ensure that that happens. Your answer has, I think, answered Richard's question, which was how can we possibly put things right? And if the vote on the police crime sentencing courts bill taught us anything, is that the Tories will use their supermajority to do whatever they want. I think your previous question probably touched on that. Richard Scott's question is about what is your view on the only credible way forward being a progressive alliance, the opposition parties working together? Do you think that could work?
Well, I'm not, you know, I'm not a politician, and I'm not strategic about in understanding Westminster. But yeah, I was having a little fantasy the other day, which was that Caroline Lucas is Prime Minister. She's leading the Progressive Alliance, And I was like, Christina Pargle can be chief scientific advisor, and Trish Greenhalgh can be chief medical officer. And I just had a little sort of flight of fantasy about what's a kind of like this country which I would like to live in. But so I don't know. I think Tom will have a much better sense of understanding whether this kind of coalition alliance is something which could ever be possible. But one can dream is my answer, I think, on that.
Well, don't want to reveal too much, but clearly there are efforts underway to try to ensure that there is an alliance, albeit possibly not one quite as prominent as some people might be arguing for. I think the difficulty with that is that it's not predictable what happens in terms of how people might vote if things are formalized in an open manner. But clearly there are significant moves underway to ensure that there is a more united front from the parties that are on in the centre left and left of the political spectrum. We have a question from Vicky, and that is, do you think that actually you do need more than one government to take on social media, e.g. the EU appears to be taking quite a prominent role? Should we try to, perhaps the UK, try to form some sort of alliance with the EU to join their efforts to control social media?
Well, I think, yeah, the EU is definitely important, and it's definitely Silicon Valley fears it. You know, of course, I think our leverage in the EU is, yes, somewhat diminished, obviously, by Brexit. So, I mean, I think the difficulty is that we've seen is that the Conservative government has not, you know, it refused, for example, to back the demands of Parliament. You know, the DCMS committee made a whole lot of demands and suggestions about what we could do with social media companies, which you know, were ignored. There's not an appetite for you know, for many of these. In many ways, is that, you know, of course politicians like to rely upon the social media platforms for their own campaigns. So there's a sort of reluctance to get rid of tools which they find useful. But, you know, there are, I mean, one is a little bit hopeful about what is happening in America, where there is definitely an appetite and support for reining in the tech giants and potentially for breaking them up. So at the moment, I think that is the sort of like most promising area, I'd have to say.
Thank you, Carole. Richard's just asked for a short version of what's been said so far. I suppose the key thing that's been said so far is that the big companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter are very hard for, it's very difficult for people, or indeed sometimes governments, to control what they're doing and make sure that what they're doing is fair and just. So I think that's the key thing that's come out so far. We have a further question from James. This is much more specific about the research that you do. And that is, do you mainly rely on open source research on the web, or do you need to ask for special access to sources, people, organizations, in other words, things that you probably have to pay for?
Well, I mean, I think within investigative journalism, your best resource is people. And it's kind of people telling you things and people giving you things, and that's where I sort of think that the greatest sort of resource comes from. And certainly when I was sort of investigating Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit referendum, it was, you know, that was where my big breakthroughs were, from finding these ex-employees and people on the inside who were able to sort of blow the whistle in that way. But yeah, but at the same time, open source research is really important. And, you know, it's amazing, it's amazing what's out there in many ways. And in some ways, the trick is, it's about how you bring it together and how you sort of tell that story. But you know, one of the things actually, one of the sort of inspiring things for setting up the Citizens was this fact that it was, because I didn't have a big sort of team around me in terms of the journalism, I really relied upon experts that I found elsewhere. And so it was a lot of academics and lawyers, people sort of not just from Britain, but from a sort of a lot of different countries. But it was also just random people on Twitter who were doing, you know, I discovered who were doing sort of research into something or other. And, you know, there's a lot of people who I relied upon and learned from, who were, as I sort of say, just like ordinary people who were doing their own digging. In fact, some of the best investigators I know are not journalists. They're people who brought their skills. One of them's a woman who, she worked for one of the big accountancy firms, and she's done this sort of amazing research into particularly Trump's connections with the Russia campaign. And there's somebody who actually works with, so with the Citizens, one of the things that we've sort of deliberately set out to do is to bring people from other spheres into this sort of journalistic infrastructure to help us in that way. So it's like we've brought in filmmakers, and somebody's got a creative director from advertising, but we've also got these open source investigators who they do things like investigating online trolls, and you know, when like a pile-on occurs, we've got somebody who sort of sleuths to sort of try and figure out what's happening and who's behind certain accounts and things. So yeah, sorry, I've drifted slightly off topic there, but it's this, it's open, that's it, open source investigation is very important, I would say.
Thank you. You mentioned Russia, and I want to ask you a quick question on that, and that is whether, did you come to any conclusion as to whether the Russians either influenced the Brexit referendum, but in a way that probably didn't affect the result, or have you come to the conclusion you don't know the answer because the government didn't actually investigate it, and therefore one can't draw any conclusions about the influence or otherwise of the Russians on that referendum?
So it's a really good question. And yeah, essentially we don't know the answer to it, but I'm very involved now so at the Citizens, we have been organising and leading a court case against the government with 4 MPs and 2 members of the House of Lords. And that is, we've been trying to judicially review Boris Johnson's refusal to act upon the recommendations of the Intelligence and Security Committee to have an inquiry into Russian interference, essentially since 2015. And you know, it's been absolutely fascinating, the progress. So you know, I don't know if you remember all of the fuss about the Russia report. So it was Dominic Grieve stood up in Parliament just before the 2019 election, and he said, my committee, he was the chair of the committee, and he said, my committee, you know, we've spent 2 years on this, writing this Russia report, talking to experts, and we've got it all ready. It's been vetted by the security services. It's ready to publish, but then we passed it to number 10. And now they're sitting on it and refusing to publish it before the election. And so, you know, there was a big fuss then, is that the government refused to publish it. And then what happened is they then tried to put when the committee came back, they tried to appoint their man as the chair of it. And there was this mini revolution inside the committee. And instead, Julian Lewis, a sort of very independent-minded MP, took over. And the first thing he did was publish the Russia report. And, you know, it was very clear in what it said. It was, you know, and it was very damning of what had happened, because it just said that, you know, it's that everybody was asleep at the wheel and not a single government agency had been directed to protect our elections. And we desperately, the only way we can protect our elections going forward is if we work out what has happened. And, you know, this is in the context of, we know in America, you know, that there has been huge amounts of work done into understanding the ways that these technology platforms were undermined by Russia in their 2016 and 2020 election. And literally not a single bit of investigation has gone on in Britain, even though the government admitted that in 2019 that Russia had tried to, there was a hack and leak operation, and it was Labour who was fooled and distributed it. But there was a hack and leak operation, and that was the Russian security services. So you know, to go to it is that in the referendum, no, we don't know. We have no definitive answer. We know that there was, you know, that there was the DCMS report talks about what was happening online with bots and trolls, and it talks about the influence of the Russian media outlets. But I mean, I think the thing which sort of most flabbergasted me, I think, with the really profoundly depressed me, was that on the publication of the Russia report is that it felt like, it really had felt that sort of for 4 years is that there was like a tiny number of freelance journalists who are the only people who are looking into this. And so it turned out, I mean, it was literally that. It was literally that I seem to have done more kind of like investigation into it than MI5, apparently. So, and that is like, if that's personally, I find kind of completely terrifying.
And what is strange, of course, is that just a couple of days ago, the government announced a great fanfare that they were going to introduce legislation that was going to stop foreign interference in elections. It seems bizarre, therefore, that they weren't willing to investigate one that happened just a few years ago. On the subject of Russia and disinformation, this is a question from Catherine Bearder. Where do you think the biggest threat of misinformation is coming from? Is it Russia? China now playing an active role, or is it some of the groups in the US, the far right groups, who are feeding that process of disinformation?
I think it's really hard to know. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, in America, for example, you know, in the last election, we know that there were these attempts by foreign powers, but yeah, we also know that actually it was the domestic, it was, you know, that now it's these domestic groups which have been radicalized. You know, and they really have been radicalized, and they've been radicalized online. You know, that's what QAnon is. QAnon is a, you know, very dangerous conspiracist organization which didn't exist a couple of years ago. And that is these algorithms of the, you know, of the social media companies have, you know, grown this to now, you know, to such a degree. I mean, the thing I sort of say whenever I do panels in America these days, I'm always like, you know, I know that it was terrible. January the 6th was obviously awful for you, but for anybody who's been shouting about disinformation, it was sort of like, at last, now will you understand this, like what happens? And I think, you know, I think in America they have understood that lesson, like, you know, came very scarily home. And in Britain, we haven't at all, you know, even though we know, you know, again, you go back to like what happened in the referendum and the fact that we know that, you know, the whole stuff about Turkey joining the EU. I mean, this was, I mean, it was, you know, it was lies. It was just misinformation. And again, it was sort of, you know, it was the social media platforms that enabled that to be, you know, completely micro-targeted to people, you know, based on data. We don't know where that came from, you know, in these invisible dark ads that nobody else could see. I mean, it's just not democracy. That is the whole thing about this online campaigning in that way, this, you know, delivering, you know, missile grade misinformation direct to individuals via their phones and computer screens. I mean, this idea of kind of like having political debates out in the open, it's literally the opposite to that.
Okay, we've got another question from Richard, and that is, do you think that Biden is going to make any difference? Do you think, for instance, that either standing up for liberal democracy or alternatively being willing to take on the social media companies in the US, do you have any feel for whether he is going to be a supporter in effect?
I mean, I know from American friends, I think, there was this sort of tremendous sigh of relief, wasn't there, when he got elected? And I think there's a very short window of time for him to be able to sort of like make an impact. But I know from, friends in the States, they're already terrified about the midterms and what's going to happen then. And then, it feels like, I think in terms of for the state of liberal democracy, it's been a reprieve, but it's not a salvation. And and I think we can see that here in Britain, can't we? Is that the sort of dismantling of our institutions and safeguards is happening on a daily basis. And even in many respects, I think we sat here and felt relief that Trump was so much worse. But I think you sort of like really have to question that, given that the sort of Johnsonian revolution is effective. It's doing stuff, and it's doing stuff on a daily basis that's going to be difficult to reverse, I think.
Well, this question from Mark is very much a follow-on from that, and that is, do you think that the Nolan principles on standards in public life, which talk about things like integrity and honesty in our politicians, do you think that that is now totally irrelevant, or is there some way of trying to enforce these principles?
I mean, I don't. What do you think? What does anybody else think? I feel like I'm not the best person to sort of answer on that. I'd like to know what other people think on that. I mean, it feels like, I think this sort of, I think there's been so many things. It feels to me there's been so many things in this country which have rested upon the concept of a gentleman's agreement, including, of course, our unwritten constitution. And it was this sort of idea of fair play and, we can sort of trust in these norms. And every time there has been one of those, you just it gets taken advantage of. And that actually it's not enough of a protection. And, I think of that particularly with regard to our electoral laws. That was my sort of discovery when I was like looking into this thing, into that what happened in the referendum, was that the entire system relies upon the idea of good chaps, and good chaps would just report after the election like what they'd spent. And so it's the whole thing operated on trust. And the idea that in a sort of once in a lifetime election that you could therefore trust people to act in a way which was above the law, it turned out to be false. And so I mean, so in that I feel fits in with the sort of the same idea of the Nolan principles, is that it's been degraded. I think the sort of like whole idea of integrity, honesty, ethics. I mean, they just don't have the status they once had, do they?
Well, I suppose people can make suggestions in the chat about whether they think it is past, it's past its sell-by date. But perhaps these things eventually have a habit of catching up with governments, in the way that eventually John Major's government and the back to basics policies eventually caught up with him, and maybe the same will happen with this government. Alison has a very interesting question. That is, she says that she lives in a very middle of the road suburb in Newcastle, and that the people she talks to there have no idea of the political changes that are happening to our democracy, and show perhaps little interest in it. So is there something that we can do to make people more interested in these issues when they're perhaps not surprisingly, very much focused on COVID handling at the moment.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, I think definitely trying to sort of like put these issues in a sort of local context and a local frame, and that's where sort of local media is so important. And that's one, again, comes back. So again, to bring it back to the tech platforms is, one of the reasons why local media has been so diminished is because it can no longer, its business model vanished, because advertising vanished, because now it's all online. So, and that has, that's one of the reasons which makes misinformation people so much more receptive to it, because there's not a kind of good bulwark of, local reporting, etc. So, I mean, it's just one of these things I don't know the answer to. I know that that's something that we're trying to do. We're looking at a project which is trying to bring sort of investigative journalism. We're doing a pilot in York. We want to do a pilot in Yorkshire, which is where we sort of, actually one of the things we're trying to do is replicate what the Taxpayers Alliance did, which is the Taxpayers Alliance did this strategy of all around the country doing FOIs and finding kind of little bits of information about, spending on the local hospital or something. And they use this to create stories to give to local media about, government wasting and local boroughs wasting money on excess spending. And so we're sort of thinking about how we can bring these, this sort of accountability journalism out at a sort of local level to bring these issues more home to sort of like people in their community. But it's a tiny little project, and it's a big hill to climb.
Michael Sinclair has drawn attention to citizens' assemblies, and I'm just wondering whether in any of the work that you do, you have engaged with citizens' assemblies, or whether you see them as Unlocked Democracy does, for instance, as playing a key role in trying to craft constitutional reforms that are palatable to the wider public, to then try to get the government to adopt those proposals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about them. I think they're really fascinating. I think it's a great idea. I think that they had one in Ireland, didn't they, that had a sort of enormous impact. I think any of these, from where I'm coming from, any of these things which exactly bring kind of like people's voices and bring people into the political process in a way which isn't off-putting, because I think so much of sort of party politics is just really, really off-putting. So I think I think they're a great idea in sort of, so yes, I very much support you in supporting them.
John has a question about whether you think that pupils are taught enough about sort of politics issues generally at school, and whether if there was more focus on these issues, perhaps there would be a greater engagement thereafter.
Yeah, no, I think the sort of teaching of civics and what that means, and things like the role of the press, the role of Parliament, all that kind of stuff. I don't think those are taught routinely, are they? Maybe if you take history or something like that. But yeah, I think that's a sort of, I think it's be really powerful and really needed. And it was more, I feel that sort of like, again, during the Trump era, I think we did understand that this sort of idea that sort of democracy is not an immutable thing that is going to last forever, and this feeling that actually it's just a political system that could be replaced by another political system, if we don't look after it, is I think we did capture some of that sort of, people did start to understand that. And it feels to me that some of that urgency has gone away at the moment because of the sort of disappearance of Trump. But I do feel that it's only through, you know, making people aware, and I think in that sense of like exactly sort of teaching young people about what's at stake, you know, could be really powerful. So yeah, definitely in favour of that.
On the subject of making people aware, sort of questions coming from opposite ends of the spectrum. First of all, do you work actively with bylines now in terms of their sort of news output? And what contribution do you think GB News is going to play in terms of helping inform the debate?
Yeah, so I'm very much good pals with bylines. Peter Jukes was one of my sort of like a great supporter and help during the Brexit years with what I was doing. And you know, I love that you know that you know, I'm kind of completely encouraged by how sort of entrepreneurial they've been. And you know, we need more independent journalism. I mean, that, and the more sort of, you know, diversity we can have, that the better. And yeah, I think these regional initiatives, again, really important. And with GB News, I've sort of, you know, I'm kind of horrified by it. I mean, I'm slightly cheered up at how crap it is, as I think a lot of people have been, but at the same time, it's, you know, it's a disinformation engine, and it doesn't really, you know, the whole model, it doesn't really matter if nobody watches it, because it's these clips which go online that then, you know, cause controversy and change the nature of the sort of political debate by doing so, and skew it even more rightward. That, you know, I think it's you know, dangerous, noxious. Yeah, I mean, I kind of dread it. It's almost like, I think I sort of, you know, I know at some stage they're going to come after me, for example, and you know, because during my time is that I've had so much sort of trolling, I really see the ways that this sort of, there's not just, these aren't sort of like individuals and individual outlets. There's a very sort of coordination which happens, and there's ways, you know, I know that for me, Guido Fawkes will write an attack article on me that'll get picked up by the Spectator. For Spectator, Tory MPs will start sort of tweeting about it. Then it'll go to the Telegraph. Then it will go. So it's sort of like there's this sort of, there's a whole system there, and GB, you know, to throw a kind of broadcaster into that mix, which is churning out clips on these sort of culture war talking points, I think it is a, you know, it's a sort of very powerful new entity, even, as I say, even if it is a bit shit.
Okay, well, that's quite clear. I think we've got time just for a couple more questions. So there was one from Shamali, which was, are you planning any follow-up Netflix documentaries like The Great Hack?
Well, it wasn't my documentary, The Great Hack. I very, it's kind of like, it was funny because I refused to take part in it for the first year and a half. And because you know, for all sorts of reasons. And then I kind of relented. And then it did amaze me, because I was sort of like, suddenly I was like, oh, okay, it's, you know, it gets released in something like 180 countries simultaneously. And I was like, oh, this is a, you know, it's a really powerful way of kind of getting stories across. So it was sort of amazing from that point of view, even if it was a very sort of partial rendition of the story. But I mean, I'm not personally, but we have got, with what we're doing with the citizens, you know, we've started doing sort of mini documentaries. I do, you know, I'm very pro trying to do other forms of storytelling. For, as I sort of say, there's a tiny as I think somebody else said, there's a very, very tiny percentage of people who are following what's going on in the sort of the various things that you're talking about and you're keeping track of in these sort of erosions of democracy, and finding ways of getting that to a sort of a broader audience and a younger audience in a more accessible way is, you know, I'm really, really keen on, and so definitely want to try and do more of if I can.
Great. So a question from Vanessa, which you I suppose might not actually be able to answer depending on what the legal position is, but what's happened to Arron Banks' legal actions against you?
So I mean, it's still very much ongoing, and I will have to go to court in something like, I don't know, it's probably later this year or early next year, and it's this isn't public, is it? This bit. I mean, it's just like, I mean, it's, well, you know, it's just all about, I mean, he's very all I will say is that he has very successfully chilled all reporting into, you know, through this legal action, is that there has been no other outlet has investigated or written about Arron Banks, and he did not sue The Guardian, and he did not sue TED, because it's a TED talk he's suing me over. He's definitively gone after me as an individual. You know, there's a sort of seven organizations have called this a slap suit, which means that it's a sort of something which is specifically designed to sort of you know, target a journalist to silence them, essentially. And, you know, all I'd say in that, he's been really successful. So he's achieved his ends, and it is, I don't want to say it's an ongoing headache, because kind of like that is also grist to his mill. He'd love to hear that. So that's why I don't actually want to say that publicly, but it's, yes, it's difficult, I will just say.
Okay, well, Carole, I think we've come to the end of the questions, so I'm just going to relay to you a comment really from Rob, and then we'll sort of bring things to a close. And Rob's comment is that, Carole, without you and George Monbiot, we'd be in an even darker place. Keep going and safe. So that's a comment from Rob. Do you want to say say last few words before we close the event?
Just that it's hugely encouraging. Thank you all so much for coming and for, you know, being interested, involved in what Unlock Democracy are doing. You know, as I've said, as I've put, I'm, you know, everything I'm doing at the moment is based upon this idea that actually we need to, you know, build this sort of community of people to help hold power to account, and it has to kind of come from this grassroots base, and that we have to sort of try and bring these other skills in, and I think, you know, I think there really is a sort of silent majority who aren't happy with what's happening, and who are, you know, very concerned. And quite rightly, because, you know, it's just sort of, you know, I think if we can't understand at this moment in that, you know, what is it, 152,000 people have died in Britain, and in some countries, you know, there's barely been a single death. And I think, you know, this is directly down to this populist politics and this, you know, the failure essentially of holding this government to account, and the disappearance of the mechanisms of holding the government to account. So thank you. That's all. Sorry, I was wittering again. But anyway, thank you very much. And, you know, please continue to support Unlock Democracy and other organisations. And I can see some of you have posted our website into, just to let you know, it's being rebuilt. It's a bit of a crap website at the moment, but we're very active on Twitter at All the Citizens, and Independent Sage, they're on Twitter as well. So anyway, we'd love to have you following us, or anyway, sorry, I'm drifting off again. Tom, take over.
Well, thank you very much, Carole. And there are lots and lots of very positive comments in the chat about you, and people were clearly here to hear a little bit perhaps about Unlock Democracy, but to hear a lot more about Carole Cadwalladr and your campaigning. So thank you very much. And I will just leave by saying that thank you to everyone who came. And I'd like to reassure you all that organisations like ours, like Carole's, and lots of other organisations in the sector are working together to try to tackle some of these fundamental issues in our democracy. And we would welcome you joining any of our organisations to help this campaign. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Tom, for having me. And yeah, thanks again to everybody for coming along.
And thank you to Alice and Sean for organising the event tonight. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you all again.
Cheerio. Bye.
Cheers.